Karen Wolf, you are the director of the Omohundro Institute. Would you tell us why you were excited about the Doing History series?
The Doing History series seems to me like a natural extension of what the Omohundro Institute has been doing since the 1940s. That is, that we sponsor opportunities for scholars to talk about doing history. These conversations are important because they refine someone's work. It sounds a little boring, but it's not boring in the slightest to say that revision is what makes for excellence. And when scholars present their work and talk about their work, they refine that work, and they refine it and refine it and refine it. And ultimately what a reader gets at the end is the result of a whole lot of conversation and a whole lot of back and forth.
Ben Franklin's World is proud to be a part of this scholarly conversation and to partner with the Omohundro Institute to present Doing History, a series about how historians work.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 66 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. How do historians choose their research projects? How do they decide to pursue one research project when another project appears to be equally as interesting? Today, we begin the Doing History series by exploring this very aspect of how historians work. Our guest for this exploration is Simon Newman. Simon has a strong interest in the way that average, poor, and enslaved men and women lived their day-to-day lives in the early United States. So we're going to speak with Simon about his research interests and then take a behind-the-scenes look at how he came to study political revelers, indentured and enslaved plantation laborers, and poor people in late 18th century Philadelphia. During our conversation, Simon reveals information about life for the urban poor in early America, how the plantation slavery system developed in the British Atlantic world, and the intellectual journeys that led Simon to his various research projects. Are you ready to discover how historians do history? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a professor of history at the University of Glasgow. He has written 3 books and 34 articles and book chapters, and he has co-authored another 5 books. His research interests have included popular politics and post-revolutionary America, the lives of the poor in late 18th century Philadelphia, and the development of plantation slavery in the British Atlantic world. Today, he joins us to discuss how he selects his research topics as part of our special Doing History, How Historians Work series. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Simon Newman.
Thank you. I'm delighted to take part.
Simon, your publications reflect that you have a really strong interest in the way that average, poor, and enslaved men and women lived their day-to-day lives in the early United States. I wonder if you would tell us a story or two about how these early Americans lived.
Well, life was very difficult for the lower sort in early national America. High rates of disease, infant mortality, low life expectancy, especially compared to rural areas, were the norm. As we know, late 18th century America was largely rural, and the urban areas I've been looking at, places like Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, were very small cities by European standards. But having said that, they were incredibly densely populated, so that by 1800, even though the settled part of Philadelphia was very small, probably about 2 square miles, the population density was close to 45,000 people per square mile. And if you want a modern comparison, population density in New York City today is about 27,000 per square mile. So it's much more densely populated, even though it's very small, than present-day New York City. So even though these cities are small, they're real focal points for the country. And because America was rural, the cities are actually very important because all of the rural exports to Europe and elsewhere have to go through the cities. Every major city was a port. And then all of the manufactured and other goods and all the new immigrants coming into America were going through these cities. And as well as immigrants from outside of the country, you have people coming in, for example, runaway slaves or free black people, people coming from the countryside who are looking for new opportunities in the towns and cities. But I think one of the major problems for urban populations was that this concentration meant disease traveled very quickly. And because they're all port cities, every new ship arriving brings the potential for the spread of disease, especially as so many ships are coming from the Caribbean and West Africa. So yellow fever, smallpox, diseases like that come in all the time. And wealthier residents could, if a disease came into the city, usually escape to a rural estate. But of course, the poor couldn't usually do that. So, for example, in 1793, when a very bad yellow fever epidemic breaks out in Philadelphia, we think that about 5,000 people died. That's probably about 10% of the population, and most of them were poorer working people. And at the same time, because the population of these cities was growing very fast, city authorities and the elite tended to be quite concerned. They were worried about crime, joblessness, the unemployed, and so they're very strict. It's effectively a crime to be unemployed and homeless. And if you're found in that condition, you're either thrown out of the city or potentially put in jail or the almshouse and forced to work. So it's a very harsh existence.
I live in Boston, and one of the aspects that I love living in Boston is we have every major city amenity without the population density. But now I'm questioning whether I would have loved to live in 18th century Boston.
Yes, I wonder about that sort of thing all the time. I've often thought about, the city I know the most about is Philadelphia, although I know something about Boston and Charleston and New York. And I've often thought how great it would have been to walk around late 18th century Philadelphia. It was so small. It's a walking city, is what we often call it. You could go from north to south in probably 40 minutes and from east to west in about 20, from the Delaware River to where the western extent of the constructed city. But what we're beginning to realize is that people didn't move around, that even though these cities were very small, they stayed in the neighborhood where they lived and worked. And they bought their food there, and they socialized there, and that these people didn't move around much. And if you did, you tended to move around not on foot, but on horseback or in carriages, especially if you were wealthier. I think it would have been a very strange place to us, because we're used to these East Coast cities today, like Boston and New York and Philadelphia, to be walking cities. We walk all around them. If you have time, it's very nice to walk from Boston Common several miles to another part of the city and to really get a sense of the city. People didn't do that then. They were very densely populated and in some ways, I think, quite unpleasant places.
We're going to revisit the people that you study throughout the course of our conversation, but I wonder if you could tell us where the process of finding a research topic begins. I mean, how do historians choose what they research?
Well, I don't think there's a single process. I think most of us work differently and we come to particular projects in particular ways. Speaking for myself, I think my work usually starts with an interest in a particular thing, and I read about a person or an event or a situation, and I'm curious to learn more. It usually means I have questions that aren't answered. Why did such and such happen? What was the experience of this event like for some of the people affected, or things like that. And so I read a little more, and if I'm still not finding answers to my question, I begin to think, there may be a topic here, there's room here for some new work. At the same time, I think it's important to realize that research topics like this evolve. So my first book began when I realized that virtually nothing had been written on the impact of the French Revolution in the United States since a book by Charles Downer Hazen in 1897. So nothing much had been done for a long time. But as I began researching that topic, the French Revolution in America, I started by reading newspapers from the 1790s, and I became fascinated by the many, many accounts in them of celebrations and processions and feasts and events like that, organized by Americans who were enthusiastic about the French Revolution. And as I read them, I realized that they were happening against the backdrop of the development of the first political parties, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans, and that these were actually quite political events. Federalists didn't like the French Revolution and didn't celebrate it. The Jeffersonian Republicans did. And so my project began to develop into something quite different, a study of what I called festive culture, including celebrations of the French Revolution, Independence Day, Washington's birthday, things like that, and how significant they were for the development of the first party system, but really looking at how it was ordinary Americans who were participating in and often organizing these festivals. So in a case like that, I began by researching one thing and ended up somewhere completely different.
I wonder if it would help us understand how to select a research topic by hearing the story about how you became interested in the Americans' reception of the French Revolution in the United States.
That's an interesting question. I think it was because I recognized, and perhaps this is in part coming from Europe and being British-born and raised in Britain, the French Revolution occupies a very important place in Western European history. It really is many historians consider it the birth of modern Europe. And when I came to America as a graduate student and was doing my graduate degrees, American historians barely knew anything about the French Revolution and were much less interested in it. It was all about the American Revolution and that's the creation of modern America. And I was surprised by that. I thought, well, did people at the time really think that? Did Americans in the 1790s think the French Revolution was unimportant? And that's why when I realized nothing had been written about it for a long time, I thought this is worth a look.
Let's look at another research topic of yours. In his most recent book, A New World of Labor, The Development of Plantation Slavery in the British Atlantic, Simon explores how plantation owners in Barbados, which is a small island in the Caribbean, founded the system of chattel slavery that became the most prevalent form of slavery in British North America. Simon, would you tell us the story of how plantation slavery developed in the British Atlantic world?
I'll try. That's a huge question. I think that Barbados is where it all began. It's where the English developed and perfected large-scale plantation systems using unfree labor. They began by using men, women, and children from the British Isles, and then they shifted to using enslaved Africans. Now, as you and your listeners know, many American historians have focused on the Chesapeake, on Virginia and Maryland, and the gradual development of tobacco plantations and racial slavery in the 17th century. But during the 17th century, about 15 African slaves landed in Barbados for every one African slave who landed in the Chesapeake. So Barbados is where it's happening. Between 1627 and the end of the slave trade in 1807, over 600,000 slaves arrived in Barbados. And Barbados is only 166 square miles. It's very, very small. So what I argue in my book is that a variety of things were happening at the same time in the early 17th century. British Isles were experiencing a huge population boom and a period of warfare, both in England and in the British Isles as a whole. There was a growing population of unemployed and homeless people, a growing number of convicts, and then a growing number of prisoners of war. All of those groups come from England, Scotland, and Ireland. Now, it's at that time that the English are first trading in West Africa, beginning to learn about slavery, and it's at that time that they're colonizing Barbados. As they develop plantations in Barbados, especially when they begin growing sugar, they have a desperate need for labor. When they arrive in Barbados, no one's living there. So the only way you can make plantations work is to bring people in. And all of these factors came together. Because there are all of these people in the British Isles, prisoners and unemployed people who are a problem to the state and private individuals begin shipping them to Barbados. They're made to work there for long periods, often 7 to 10 years. The conditions are terrible, and many of them die during those terms. They're not legally slaves, but in many ways they're treated like slaves. And when occasionally people escape or get back to Britain, they often complain that they had been effectively slaves. So that's how the plantation system of labor develops. And it's really only in the later 1650s, as England begins to calm down and stop sending people over and starts paying attention to what's going on in Barbados, that the Barbados planters stop importing so many white laborers from England and start buying African slaves. But really, they're then slotting African slaves into a system they've already developed using white labor. And it gets much worse for those slaves, and I wouldn't argue otherwise. But it is a system that had been founded in a very British kind of way of organizing labor. And that system then spread from Barbados across the Caribbean to Jamaica and beyond, and from there to South Carolina and throughout the American Deep South. So my argument is that the kind of plantation system that characterized the American Deep South really came more from Barbados than it did from the Chesapeake.
In an earlier episode, we spoke with Malcolm Gaskill about the role that Ireland played in American colonization. Did Ireland also play a role in the way that their system of servitude labor worked when they came over to the Caribbean and North America?
Yes, it did. When these forced laborers are being brought over from the British Isles, some are kidnapped, and the word that you would have heard in England at that time was Barbadosed, and that meant someone who's kidnapped and forced to labor in Barbados. But then also there are these convicts and prisoners of war. There are a lot of convicts and prisoners sent from Scotland, and this is during the period of the English Civil War and the War of the Three Kingdoms, when it spreads to Scotland and Ireland. So as people are captured in Scotland, they're often sent over. But then when Cromwell and his armies go into Ireland and put down the Irish population, a lot of those people are sent too. So when Cromwell, for example, attacks the city of Drogheda, not far from Dublin, the rules of war say that if a city doesn't surrender, you can, if you capture it, kill everyone in the city, civilians and military alike. Now, very rarely did that happen, but Cromwell wasn't a typical soldier of his time. Drogheda refused to surrender. It was eventually captured. Many of its population were killed, and those who weren't were sent in chains to labor in the colonies. They are treated as inferior people. All of the attitudes of the English towards the Catholic Irish as almost subhuman, inferior, and not deserving of the rights of Englishmen came out in the way that they treated these Irish laborers in Barbados terribly. And there are plenty of accounts of these Barbados planters saying, send us the Scots. We like the Scots. They're Protestants. They're good workers. They're well educated. We can work with these people. Stop sending us the Irish. We hate these people. And they're terrified as they begin bringing slaves in that the Irish and the slaves enslaved Africans will actually work together and rebel against them. So yes, these kinds of attitudes towards the Irish and the use of the Irish is a very important part of this story.
This is a fascinating topic. Would you tell us how you found the topic of plantation slavery development and why you decided to research it?
Well, this is another example of how sometimes you begin researching one topic and you end up somewhere completely different. I'd started, and this is over 10 years ago now, with the idea of writing a book about labor in the Atlantic world. And what I thought was, in the 17th and 18th century, as people and goods begin moving around the Atlantic world between Britain and Europe and West Africa and the Caribbean and North America, that must have changed the work people did on a daily basis all around the Atlantic. And I started that project by researching West Africa, and in particular the Gold Coast, what is today Ghana. It was a new field to me. I was fascinated by the research and what I found, and in particular about how the British agents on the Gold Coast experienced and utilized West African slaves. And they owned slaves, they called them castle slaves, who were employed by the British in order to help with the slave trade. And what I realized as I was reading these records is this wasn't slavery as I, as an American historian, recognized it. The castle slaves had a fair amount of independence. They occasionally went on strike or protested their conditions. They were effectively paid, and they were paid in British trade goods, things like fabric, guns, swords, and other commodities. This was a very West African kind of slavery, not an American kind of slavery. And this just fascinated me. To pay slaves with weapons just didn't make sense. And I started asking myself, okay, if this was the system of slavery in West Africa that the British encountered and continued to use all through the 17th and 18th centuries, why did they then in the New World create something completely different? A very different kind of slavery, which was much more brutal and gave the enslaved far fewer rights or privileges. And that's how my project transformed into a study of the origins of plantation slavery.
Helena would like to know if you looked at any historical sources before you settled on your research topic. And it sounds like you started with a different research topic from the one that you ended up writing a book about. But did you consult any sources? And if so, how did these sources influence your decision to research and write your book on plantation slavery?
Well, Helena is spot on with that question. I began my research here in the UK in the National Archives in London, looking at the records of the Royal African Company, which are on deposit there. And those are the records of the various companies that were responsible for the British slave trade. It's a huge archive, about 1,500 boxes and volumes of materials. And as I started looking at these materials and trying to figure my way around them, because they're not incredibly well catalogued, I became really interested by the accounts of West African society and slavery and of the castle slaves I just mentioned in all of the British forts along the coast, like Cape Coast Castle, which is the main one on the Gold Coast. It's a huge structure, major trading operation. The building was probably the largest building in sub-Saharan Africa. And as I read the account books and the inventories and the letters and the detailed reports sent by British workers and officials back to London, they drew me into their world and made me start thinking about slavery first in West Africa, but then in the British colonies in the New World. And I started asking questions I hadn't asked before. So I think that what Helena's question points to is a really important aspect of historical research. We all tend to start with a topic or an idea, and we usually have some idea about what we're going to find. But I think it's very important to be open-minded as we do our research and be prepared for surprises which challenge our ideas and assumptions. And then what I found is it pushed me in a different direction and made me think about new questions.
Slavery seems to be a popular research topic. I mean, if we looked on Amazon.com and ran a search for books on slavery or browsed the bookshelves of our local library, we would find a lot of books about slavery. Alec would like to know how you were able to recognize that there was room for one more book about slavery.
That's a really interesting point. As my project developed into one about slavery, I was very nervous, partly for the reason that he points out, that there's a huge literature on slavery already, but also because I wasn't a historian of slavery. That's not what I worked on for most of my career up to that point. So I was worried that as a relative newcomer to the subject, how was I going to possibly say anything new when there was so much scholarship out there already? But I think what gave me confidence was recognizing that where I live and where I do most of my research and what I was finding could allow me to do something new and make a contribution that didn't duplicate existing work. Because I'm based in Britain and because I did most of the research for this book in British libraries and archives and a little bit of the research in Ghana and in Barbados, I was able to write a book which argued that British history and what was going on in Britain and the changes in its labor system, and then West African history and Barbados history all came together in this entirely new labor system in Barbados, and that this labor system then eventually shaped slavery in the Deep South of the United States. And so I think I was doing things in a different way with different materials than historians of slavery in the US usually use, and that as a result I was able to disagree with some of the histories that had shaped my own thinking about slavery when I was a student, works like Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, and put out some new ideas that are based on my own research.
Simon, taking a behind-the-scenes look at your slavery project has been really helpful. So why don't we take a look at your second book project too? Would you tell us about your second book, Embodied History, The Lives of the Poor in Early Philadelphia? What was life like for poor people in late 18th century Philadelphia?
It was tough, in a word. That book was about the poor, and in early national Philadelphia, poverty was a hard physical experience. The poor were never far from being hungry, cold, jobless, homeless. The book is separated into chapters on different institutions and the poor within them: the prison, the almshouse, church burial records, the hospital for the poor, sailors, different groups, different institutions. And it focuses on the poorest of the working population, often when they were experiencing particular problems like disease, bereavement, illness, or incarceration. So I can give you an example I was thinking about this morning. Edward Ridley was a Philadelphia sailor, so he was a member of the largest and most important working group in Philadelphia. But it's a very poorly paid workforce, and the members of this workforce, the sailors, often spend months and even years away from home. What that means is that they're leaving their wives and children to fend for themselves. And what interested me about the record I found about Edward Riley and his family was that he probably never even saw his newborn son, Alexander, because he was away at sea. And Alexander's mother, Edward Ridley's wife, Jane, was forced to make money to support herself and her new baby in the only way she could, by hiring herself out as a wet nurse. So while she was nursing another, a richer woman's baby, she had to entrust her own son, Alexander, to another, cheaper wet nurse. And while the child that Jane nursed thrived, her own son, Alexander, weakened, and he developed an infection and he died. And then the sad end to the story was Jane had to beg the minister of her local church to perform a funeral service and bury the baby in the church graveyard because she had no money for a funeral service and she didn't want him buried without ceremony in the pauper's field. So when you read stories like that, you realize this is a very hard existence.
In Embodied History, Simon explores the ways that the physical bodies of Philadelphia's poor adds to our present-day understanding of the social and cultural history of the early republic. Simon, would you tell us how you went about researching a history of bodies and how bodies of Philadelphia's poor people adds to our understanding of the early American past?
Well, this project comes back to the question of research and sources. One of the reasons why so many historians have written about late 18th and early 19th century Philadelphia is that the city has a remarkable collection of surviving records. And my book required excellent records from the hospital, the prison, the almshouse, newspapers, church burial records, and so forth. No other American city from this time period has such extensive records of this type for all of these institutions. This was the kind of research project which required extensive research in Philadelphia itself. A few of the sources were available digitally, so I was looking at runaway slave and servant advertisements, which were found in the newspapers like the Pennsylvania Gazette, and those have been digitized, so you can really look at those anywhere in the world. But most of the records I was using exist only in manuscript form in places like the Philadelphia City Archives, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So I spent the best part of a year in Philadelphia researching those records, compiling a huge amount of data. And as I did that, I was guided by the archivists and librarians at those archives. I think that what fascinated me was that the bodies themselves became the text, became the records of these people and their lives. That if I was writing about Thomas Jefferson, I would go to Thomas Jefferson's writings. I'd go to the letters he sent, the book he published, all of the materials he wrote and produced and that were written and produced about him. But if I'm looking at someone like the Jane Ridley, who I just mentioned, and her baby son, Alexander, there are no written records. She left no diary. She left no letters. The only record I have of them are these descriptions. And the minister, Nicholas Colleen, who buried her young son in the churchyard, writes in detail about his final illness and how and why he died. So I found a lot of these records, the only records that exist of these people are descriptions of their bodies as much as it is about their intellectual lives. And I found that this was a fascinating way to try and reconstruct their lives and experiences through these descriptions of their bodies.
These are sad topics. How do you go about researching the sources in a fair way that also allows you to function emotionally?
Yes, I get asked questions like that quite a lot. It's not always possible, and sometimes I have to just walk away from it and take some time out. But a lot of the time, I think what keeps me going is the thought that these were people whose lives mattered. They mattered to themselves as individuals, and they mattered to their families. And it's so easy to forget them. It's so easy to write a history of early national America, which focuses on the political elite, on the constitutional system, on the achievements of the country as a whole, because many of the records talk about that. And the people who are doing a lot of the work of building a new country tend to get forgotten. And that I think by rescuing these stories, many of which do come across as very sad, it's possible to get a sense of what these lives were like and what was involved in creating the new American Republic. So I find a satisfaction, in a sense, trying to rescue stories that have been forgotten.
David speculates that most historians have more research projects that they would like to pursue than they can actually pursue. So David would like to know if this is the case with you and what you do with all the great ideas you have for research that you don't actually have time to explore.
Oh, don't remind me. I mean, that's a constant source of frustration, and I suspect not just for me, but for many historians. There are lots of ideas that we never have time to follow up. One of the advantages of teaching at a university, though, is that sometimes undergraduates and graduate students are looking for ideas for research papers and essays. And when that happens, I often try to get a sense of what they're interested in. And sometimes I can suggest a few topics which might include projects I'm interested in but don't have time to research. And it can be a little difficult passing on one of my own research ideas, but I'd rather see someone else having fun researching it than it sitting in the back of my mind going nowhere. So, for example, fairly recently, I've become quite interested in the use of medicine on slave ships, but I don't have time to look at that. And I have a student who, as a master's student and now potentially as a PhD student, has become very interested in that and is developing that project. I don't have time to do that and probably never will, but it's great to see it happening.
How do you know that you've found the research project that you want to pursue, that you're willing to write a book about it when there's just so many great topics out there to research?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think the most important thing is to spend a little time with a topic and to convince yourself that you will be happy working on that topic for a long time. A couple of my books, my last book, took me the best part of 10 years to research and write. It was a big project requiring research in African history and Caribbean history and British history and even North American history. So you have to become convinced that you'll be happy reading this material day in and day out for a long time. So I think that's the most important thing. You've got to become convinced that it will sustain your interest. I think you also need to make sure that it's a project that's doable. And what I mean by doable is that it can't be too ambitious. So if a student comes to me and says they want to write an original research paper on the civil rights movement in 1950s America, and I mean a student here at the University of Glasgow, I would have to gently tell them that they can't do it. To begin with, it would require years of research. It's much too big and ambitious. And moreover, an awful lot's already been written about it. So it would be very difficult for them sitting here in Glasgow with the materials available to them to write something new and original. And there's no point in them doing lots of work and just reinventing the wheel. But then you can think about that creatively. So I would encourage them to do that. And one example would be, I've had a student here a couple of years ago who was very interested in American civil rights. And so what she ended up doing was researching how American civil rights was reported in British newspapers, particularly Scottish newspapers, and the ways in which it was related to race in British society. So that allowed the student to read about the subject that interested them, American civil rights, but to actually write a research paper that was original, that I don't think anyone had done before, with the materials that were easily available to them.
It sounds like to find these original ideas, we really need to be curious and read about the topics that interest us, to read all the literature that's available.
Yes, I think that's exactly so. And as well as reading, I think the most important thing for all of us, from students all the way to professors like myself, is you have to talk to archivists and librarians. They are our greatest resource. They will be able to show and help us figure out areas that we don't know, what's been written, what's available, the kinds of secondary material written by other historians, the kinds of sources available. It's a very individual process, researching and writing history, but it's very collaborative and very much a community endeavor when you think about the whole research process. Very few people do it all on their own. So it does require a lot of reading and a lot of individual work, but a lot of that we can get assistance from people whose job it is to know what's out there and to help us discover that literature and those sources.
You've offered us a lot of great advice, but I wonder if you have any more tips that you could provide those of us who are interested in history and would like to find a topic that we can research.
I think it depends in part where you are and what kinds of things you're interested in. So I think it's very important to take advantage of what's close at hand. And that's become particularly important for me because of where I live. I did my graduate work at Wisconsin and Princeton, and I taught for a few years at Northern Illinois University. So while I was in America, I was very used to doing my research in American libraries and archives. And for several years after I moved to Scotland, I regularly went back to the US every summer to do my research. But it slowly occurred to me that as a historian of 17th and 18th century America, living in Britain was as much an advantage as a disadvantage. This was the imperial center. Many of the records related to early America and the Caribbean are here in Britain. Correspondence, plantation records, things like that are in libraries all around the UK. So I started to develop research projects which enabled me to do some of my research in America, but some of my research here. And my research was shaped by what was close to hand. And that, I think, is really important, that almost all of us live within a reasonable distance of historical collections. So you can be living in rural Wisconsin or anywhere in North America, and there are libraries and archives and museums with materials not too far away. And then, of course, the other thing is that in this digital age, a huge amount of material is available digitally. So, for example, virtually everything printed in America and Britain up to 1800 has been digitized. Now, some of those materials are behind a paywall, but at public libraries or by getting a free trial, it's possible to access them. And then many more materials are free. So, for example, if you look up Mead, MEAD, which is the magazine of early American data sets, you can find an online database where historians are donating the data they've accumulated over the years, things like a census of all black people in Philadelphia in 1790. And then there are other surprising sources. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is one of the best for early American historians because they have microfilmed and digitized huge amounts of early American data. And many of their churches have reading rooms where anyone, you don't have to be a member of the church, anyone can go in and consult the records. So I've had the experience of sitting in the reading room of the church here in Glasgow, in Scotland, finding out that the church had microfilmed some Philadelphia records from the 1790s that I wanted. I filled out a form and gave it to the librarian. I think I had to pay a few dollars. And 3 weeks later, the microfilm arrived from Salt Lake City. So I was sitting in Glasgow, Scotland, reading a microfilm of materials from Philadelphia. So I think it's possible to find and access material almost anywhere now.
I think most of us, when we think of a historian, we picture someone in a library sitting at a desk, slouched over a lot of manuscript materials and books. But your comments reveal that the work we do is actually highly collaborative, that we actually work with other historians, if not in person, definitely with the work they've done before us.
Yes, I find that is very much the case. And for those of us who teach, even more so, because the more we teach the kinds of material that we research, the more our students' ideas and questions push us to think about things in different ways. So yes, I think it's a tremendously collaborative endeavor. I can't imagine doing it in complete isolation. Even though a lot of my time is spent sitting at a desk surrounded by manuscripts and books, I don't think of it as a solitary occupation. I think of it as a collaborative one.
Let's move into the time warp. Normally, this is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Today, we're going to change the question up a bit. In this time warp, we are going to allow Simon to use a time machine to travel back in time.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Simon, if you could travel back in time, is there a research topic that you would tell your younger self to pursue that you did not undertake for some reason?
That's an interesting question. I do think about this sort of thing because I'm fascinated by history, by the study of people in the past, but at the same time, I feel extremely fortunate to live in the present, in a society which gives me good food, good medical care, and so forth, particularly because I study the lower classes in the 18th century. I know that theirs was a very different world of disease and hunger and mortality. If I were to go back to Philadelphia in the 1790s or Barbados in the 1650s or Jamaica in the 1780s, I know that I'd be really shocked by what I saw. But that said, I think I'd still want to go. And I think for one reason, and this is what I'd like to look at, historians like me tend to get fixated on how bad things were. I mean, if we study the lower sort, if we study slaves, it's bad. And I always have to try and make myself think about the human spirit, the desire of people to find joy and meaning in their lives, even when things are bad. One of my best friends in the field is the historian Billy Smith, and he once spent a year in India and Pakistan. And he told me that he was living amongst people who endured a poverty that he found almost unbelievable. And yet all the time he saw great joy and happiness among these people and an enthusiasm for life that was contagious. And he said to me that he learned a lot about the poor of 18th century America by living in 20th century India. So with that sort of lesson in mind, I'd go back to a slave society, probably in the Caribbean, but perhaps in South Carolina or even Virginia. And as a white person, it would be very hard for me to be accepted by enslaved black people, but I'd love to see more of the joy they found, the community they created, and the culture they fashioned for themselves. And I don't think it would make slavery any less horrible, and I would be horrified by what I saw, but it would allow me to see one of the important ways in which the enslaved resisted their condition by creating decent human lives for themselves.
What are you researching and writing about now?
I'm working on several projects at the moment. The major one explores slaves who escaped, slaves who ran away. And part of that research is with a team here at the University of Glasgow, two collaborators, Stephen Mullen and Nelson Mundell. And we're looking at slaves who were brought to England and Scotland in the 18th century and who then escaped. And that's something that people in Britain know very little about, and for that matter, people in America know very little about. But I'm also working on escaped slaves in the British Caribbean, especially Jamaica. And then finally, I'm working another collaborative project with Professor Matthew Zinnick at the U.S. Naval Academy and Professor Alyssa Bolletino at Framingham State. And we're looking at black soldiers in Jamaica during the American War for Independence. So I've got several pots on the boil at the moment, and I'm eager to work on all of them.
For those of us who have questions about the everyday life of early Americans or how we go about finding a research topic, where is the best place to look for more information about you and how we can get in contact with you?
The best place will be my University of Glasgow website, and I think you can put the URL up on your website, and that will contain a link to my email address. So that will be the quickest and easiest way to get in touch with me.
Simon, thank you for taking us behind the scenes of your research and how you find your research topics.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Be curious about a subject, read about it, and ask librarians and archivists for assistance. Simon offers us great advice. He also reminds us that doing history involves a lot of collaboration. On this show, we speak with many authors, but rarely do we ask those authors about the help they've had along the way. And most historians receive a lot of help with every book and article they write. What types of help do they receive? Well, historians bounce ideas off of other historians to see if their research ideas are good ones. They receive help from librarians and archivists who helpfully point their research in the right direction. And historians benefit from the generosity of colleagues. These colleagues read drafts of their work and offer advice to make historical thinking, writing, and interpretations better. Historians know what they know about the past, in large part due to the help they receive from others. For more information about Simon, his books, plus everything we talked about today, visit the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/066. I'd like to thank the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture for sponsoring the Doing History series. Each episode in this year-long series will take you on a behind-the-scenes tour of how historians work and how they come to know what they know about the past. Episodes in this series will air on the last Tuesday of each month throughout 2016. For more information about the Omohundro Institute, visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI or click on the link on the show notes page for this episode. Or you could click on the link in the show description in your Ben Franklin's World app. That's right, you could have the show notes for each and every episode right at your fingertips with the Ben Franklin's World app. This app is free and for both iOS and Android devices. Just search for Ben Franklin in your favorite app store or visit benfranklinsworld.com/apps for more information about how you can download this awesome app. Finally, what more would you like to know about how historians choose their research topics? Send your questions to me via email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet them to me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode, or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.